There are places where the human soul resembles an old piece of parchment, shrinking, curling, and crisping in the heat of a flame. For the heroine, such a place was the supermarket. She physically could not stand the artificial, merciless glare of fluorescent lights that seemed to suck all color from people's faces, leaving only the weary grayness of exhaustion. Yet sometimes circumstances aligned in such a way that visiting this temple of consumerism became unavoidable. That day, her mission was crystal clear and precise. She needed fish. Not just any fish, but premium, fresh sea bass. She planned to bake it in salt with rosemary and lemon slices, a light, almost dietetic dinner for one. Then, suddenly, a voice sounded from behind, deep, with that unmistakable rasp she could never confuse with anyone else's. It was the voice she'd grown accustomed to hearing at the family table during rare Sunday lunches. As always, you know exactly what to choose. The words hung in the air, piercing through the supermarket's impersonal hum. They were too intimate for this place, containing no question, only a quiet statement, as if the speaker had been watching her. She froze. Her hand, reaching toward a cluster of cherry tomatoes, stopped midair. Slowly, she turned, not like a frightened doe, but more like a queen addressed by a commoner. Keeping up appearances was a refined art she'd long mastered. Artyom, her son-in-law, stood just a few steps away, leaning casually against a shelf stacked with olive oil. He wore worn jeans and a plain gray t-shirt that clung to his torso far more eloquently than the dress shirts she usually saw him in. Just yesterday, her daughter Lena had chirped over the phone that Artyom had flown off on an important week-long business trip to Novosibirsk. Apparently, Novosibirsk had been suddenly cancelled. A faint, almost lazy smile played on his lips, and his eyes held unmistakable interest, but not the dutiful curiosity of a son-in-law toward his mother-in-law. It was the look of a man intrigued by a woman. His gaze swept over her cart, where 2 lonely sea bass fillets lay, and his smile widened. Without a word, he reached for a heavy bottle of dark glass from the adjacent shelf, walked around her cart, and set it down beside the fish with a soft clink. It was an expensive bottle of red wine, a full-bodied, intense wine meant to be savored slowly, sip by sip. Wine for long evenings, difficult conversations, and intriguing possibilities. She arched an eyebrow, her signature gesture, one that spoke louder than words and usually put people in their place. But Artyom was no ordinary person. "And why exactly did you choose that?" she asked. Her voice came out colder than she'd intended. She deliberately switched to the informal you, erasing distance, but did so in a way that sounded more like a challenge than an invitation. He answered calmly, holding her gaze. Under the harsh supermarket lighting, his eyes looked dark, almost black. "Because I know you wouldn't buy it for yourself. It suits you." His words carried disarming honesty. He was right. She would never have bought such a bottle for a solitary dinner. It would have felt excessive, improper. He saw that. He saw not just Marina Viktorovna, the stern, composed mother-in-law, but a woman who denied herself small pleasures due to self-imposed, internal rules. "And it suits you" clearly referred to far more than just the wine. The phrase echoed in her mind, plucking long-forgotten chords. "And what are you doing here?" She changed the subject, trying to reclaim control. "Did Novosibirsk relocate to our sleepy neighborhood?" He smirked. "The trip was cancelled last minute. And I didn't feel like going home." He paused, as if giving her time to absorb his words. "Lena's out with her friends, they're having a girls' night. I'm not about to crash that." He said it as casually as if commenting on the weather, but she heard fatigue and loneliness beneath his tone. A man fleeing his own home so as not to intrude on his wife's fun. The image was strange, and faintly sad. He leaned on the opposite side of her cart, so they stood facing each other across this absurd barrier of seabass and wine. He leaned in slightly, and she caught a hint of his cologne, something woody, with notes of tobacco and leather. A confident, masculine scent. "And you?" His voice dropped lower. Against the supermarket's background noise, the contrast sent a shiver down her spine. You always need someone to get in your way. It was a gut punch, bold, precise, and utterly unexpected. The word in your way carried double meaning, disrupting her dull routines, interrupting her solitary dinners, interfering with her carefully constructed image of propriety and reserve. She froze, searching his eyes for answers, and found mischievous imps dancing there, clever, playful, dangerous. What impudence, Artyom, she exhaled, but her voice betrayed her. Instead of icy steel, it held something else, surprise, perhaps even a flicker of admiration. Really? He didn't back down. His lips curved into a triumphant smirk. I thought it was called paying attention to detail. He glanced at her fish. Sea bass, a wonderful choice. Ideally, it calls for a chilled white. Then he met her eyes again, and the certainty in his gaze made her defenses crack. But I think tonight is exactly the kind of evening when rules should, and must, be broken. Don't you agree, Marina Viktorovna? Hearing her formal name at that moment sounded like the most audacious mockery. Respectful address blended with openly provocative suggestion, creating a dizzying cocktail more intoxicating than any wine. She remained silent. Her entire world, so orderly, so predictable, had suddenly tilted. This man, her son-in-law, stood before her in an ordinary supermarket, offering not just to share a meal, but to shatter her rules. Since we're both runaways today, he continued in the same conspiratorial whisper, shall we really run away, together? They reached the candy aisle. She intended to roll her cart right past, she had no use for sweets. But Artyom stopped. He didn't ask or suggest, he simply stepped to the shelf lined with colorful boxes and paused thoughtfully. His eyes scanned the labels, and she watched his mind work. Then, decisively, he reached for a very specific box, Tiki Moloko, the very kind from childhood. He turned to her, and those familiar imps danced again in his eyes. Remember, once at dinner, you mentioned you hadn't had these in ages. Said they don't make them like this anymore. He spoke so casually, as if they'd discussed it just yesterday. She stood there, desperately trying to recall when she might have said that. A year ago? 2? At some family gathering, between salad and main course, when the conversation drifted to the past? A meaningless, offhand remark, tossed into the air and forgotten by her within minutes, but not by him. He remembered. This man, her daughter's husband, remembered a fleeting comment about candies she once loved. He placed the box in her cart. Next to the wine and the fish, it settled like the missing piece of a puzzle, suddenly revealing the whole picture. The picture of an evening that was no longer hers alone. Take it. They make these properly now. Try them, he said with quiet authority that brooked no argument. The checkout line was short, just 2 people ahead. The tired cashier, her face blank with indifference, scanned items one by one. Each beat marked a passing moment. For the first time in her life, the heroine realized she didn't want this trip to end. She wanted to keep walking these ugly aisles, exchanging idle words, feeling his presence beside her, the focused attention that turned her insides warm and unsteady. For so many years, she'd lived cocooned in self-sufficiency that she'd nearly forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen, not as a mother-in-law, not as Marina Viktorovna, not as Lena's mother, but as a woman. A woman who once loved Tiki Moloko. Their turn came. She reached into her bag for her wallet, but his hand gently yet firmly covered hers, stopping her. I've got it, he murmured, so softly it was almost a whisper, yet it carried more authority than any command. He stepped forward, shielding her from the cashier's view, and handed over his card. She stood behind him, staring at his broad shoulders, feeling an absurd, forgotten, utterly inappropriate word surface in her mind, protected. He paid quickly. The cashier packed their purchases, her fish, his wine, his candy, into a single large bag. He lifted it effortlessly in one hand, as if it weighed nothing. Instinctively, the heroine moved to take it, habit kicking in, the reflex of a woman who always carried everything herself. He caught her glance and smiled that same lazy, slightly mocking smile. He waited until they'd stepped a few paces from the register toward the exit, then stopped and turned to her. They stood by the glass doors, beyond which twilight had already begun to fall. All playfulness vanished from his eyes. Only seriousness remained, and a bold, tender vulnerability. "Today, you carry nothing," he said quietly but clearly, each word striking its mark. "Not the bags, not this evening. I'm taking full responsibility." He paused, letting the words sink in, then added the final, devastating blow, "I'll be your husband. May he rest in peace." He whispered the last words almost apologetically, with a quick, self-conscious inflection that made the entire phrase even more shocking and magnetic. She said nothing. She couldn't. The air vanished. Words lodged in her throat like a prickly lump. He'd mentioned her late husband. This man, essentially a stranger, had dared to assume his role, if only in jest, for one evening. It crossed every boundary, audacity, sacrilege, and disarming care all at once. She just stared into his eyes, feeling something inside her snap, the last rope holding her orderly life in balance. Everything spiraled out of control, hurtling like a train off the rails. And amid the chaos, amid the collapse of all her rules and foundations, one thought thundered in her mind, simple and overwhelming: a man is by her side again. The car ride was deafeningly silent. The radio stayed off. They exchanged not a word. Outside, the city lights streaked past, blurring into long ribbons of color. She watched them but saw only his profile reflected in the side window, the sharp line of his jaw, the straight nose, the way he held the wheel confidently with one hand, the other resting on the gearshift. She felt his presence in every pore of her skin, a near physical pressure, warmth radiating from him in the confined space. The car stopped in front of her building, an old Stalin-era structure nestled in the quiet greenery of a courtyard. When the engine died, the silence thickened into something almost tangible, ringing in her ears. For a while, they just sat, immersed in it. She didn't know what to say or do. Logically, the evening should have ended with a thank you and her stepping out, but she remained still. He got out first, walked around the car, and opened her door. The gesture felt like it belonged to another era, another life. She stepped out, feeling awkward and stiff. He retrieved the bag from the back seat and followed her to the entrance. She wordlessly unlocked the heavy front door, and they entered the echoing stairwell, filled with the smells of dampness and dust. On the second-floor landing, outside her apartment door, he stopped and set the bag down on the wide step. The dim bulb carved his face from the shadows, deepening every contour. He looked at her with a long, serious gaze, devoid of the playfulness from the store. "I understand everything," he said quietly. His voice, low and intimate in the stairwell's acoustics, felt like a secret shared. "And I'm not asking for anything. Just tell me, if you don't want my company, I know I can be pushy." He gave her the choice. The man who'd led her all evening, breaking one rule after another, now halted at the final threshold, her doorstep, and handed her the power to decide. It was his most potent weapon. He wasn't a brute forcing his way in. He was a sharp, perceptive player who understood that true conquest happens only when the doors opened willingly. She stood holding her keys. The metal keychain chilled her palm. These keys symbolized her life, her fortress, her orderly, safe, solitary prison. She should have said, "Thank you, Artyom, for your help. I'll take it from here." She should have taken the bag and closed the door. Her mind, her habits, her entire past screamed, "No, you can't. It's wrong. It's madness." But her lips whispered something else, unbidden, beyond her control, a breathless murmur only she could hear, "Please, come in." She simply turned the key, pushed the door open wider than necessary, and stepped aside to let him pass. She didn't look at him. She stared into the dark corridor of her apartment, which suddenly felt foreign and empty. And he entered. Without hesitation. Without asking again.